So turn to Hosea. Sorry, I assumed you knew that's where I was turning. And this is the plan that we've been working. So this is about, I guess, 2/3 of the way through. We started 2 Wednesdays ago with Psalm 74, which was a psalmist saying, how long? We don't see any signs. We don't see miracles. There's no prophets. And how long before Israel is restored? And that next Sunday, we talked about, even 2,000 years after the death and resurrection and ascension of Christ, we're still waiting. And the question is, how long and what are we waiting for? Is it right to keep waiting? And should we expect a kingdom? Should we expect the return of Israel to God? Or is that, are we beyond that? Has something else changed? Has the day already come? Has the kingdom already come? You remember in Thessalonians and Timothy, we read about folks in Paul's day who were saying that day's already come. And mockers in 2 Peter saying, nothing's going to change. It's the way it's always been. There's nothing like in the days of Noah that's happened, all these stories that we read about. And we said, no, hey, this time period we're living in was foreknown by God and was foredeclared by God, that we would have this many-day period, and then we would expect a restoration of Israel, a physical kingdom with a Davidic throne, and David, as it were, ruling on that throne. And we said that's specifically declared beforehand in Hosea 3. And so David took you through Psalm 79. The next Wednesday, I wasn't here for that. I was out of town. But again, another psalm where the psalmist, an Israelite, is saying, how long, Lord? How long will it be that we're under your judgment? And then the following Sunday, we read Hosea 3. And you'll remember at the very end of that very short prophecy, I said, here's where this sort of clear and compelling statement of God about this time period that we can rest upon and trust that God had this foreordained, and we can expect a restoration of Israel and a kingdom. Here it is. And we read, for the sons of Israel will remain for many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, and without ephod or household idols. And afterward, the sons of Israel will return and seek Yahweh their God and David their king, and they'll come trembling to Yahweh and to his goodness in the last days. And we said, hey, that wasn't very compelling. That wasn't very clear. I kind of expected you to say, from 0 AD to 2000 AD, there's going to be a time period, that if you were thinking clear, maybe that's what you were thinking. We talked about, there's really 4 views of this passage. So how can you say it's clear? We looked at 3 of them. One which said, hey, there is no temporal framework here. You can't figure it out. It's just sort of ambiguous. We kind of dismissed that and said, hey, exactly the opposite's true. That's the point of the 12, is to say when. And then we looked at the view which was, hey, the many days was the exile. So Hosea prophesied before the nation of Israel was exiled. That's when they were going to be without those 6 things. And then they would turn in the last days, which is the church age, to God in a spiritual restoration. And so those promises were, our spiritual promises. The goodness of the Lord is the fruit of the Spirit. It's not a physical restoration, not a literal restoration. So that's one view that we wanted to think about. And then the other was the claim that I made, which Hosea 3 is talking about the many days of the church age. And then the last days are those days around the tribulation when Israel does return, and then the millennial kingdom is them having their Davidic king and the goodness of the Lord in the last days. And we said, again, I think it's really clear and compelling that that's what Hosea is saying. And I said it's not sky is blue, kind of clear and compelling, where you just look at it and say, hey, the sky's blue. It's very clear. It's more like a Sherlock Holmes kind of clarity, right? Where you say, wow, what's happening? And then you follow a couple of clues and you say, aha, I see. Right? And that was the claim. Here are our clues. You'll recall we said, we looked at that recipe, you remember the rice recipe, and we said, hey, things are done in order. And we said that's true of the story, the way it's written in Hebrew. That's the way the story is laid out, which isn't a very insightful finding, except when you say each of the elements of Hosea's story is also related to an element of the story between God and Israel. And so in the same way that Hosea's story is sequential, the story of God and Israel that's told through Hosea and Gomer is also sequential. And say, well, okay, that's an interesting clue. And we didn't look at using that clue. That'll be this upcoming Sunday. And then we said, hey, there's a second clue that we can follow, and that was, remember, you're reading the recipe about the rice, and what comes in the middle, right? A song or what in the world? Why did you put a poem in the middle of the recipe? And we said that's what Hosea 2 is, because the story is in Hosea 1 and 3, and right there in the middle, you've got a song, you've got a poem. And why is that? And we said, hey, it's because he's telling in a poetic or in a kind of song fashion the same story of Hosea 1 and 3. In fact, we'll see tonight, each section of it parallels a section of the story between Hosea and Gomer. And we talked about that briefly. This Sunday, again, we'll look at those clues. This upcoming Sunday, we'll look at those clues and show how that makes for a Sherlock Holmes type clear and compelling understanding of Hosea 3. Tonight, because prophecy and poetry in the Old Testament is so much harder than narrative, we're going to read Hosea 2 to just give us a little more of an introduction to that, a feel for that. But we will be very, very brief. And I mean, I don't mean like when David says he's going to be brief and he's really not. I mean, we're going to be very brief on Hosea 2. We're just going to really touch at an extremely high level. And we're going to spend the most of our time on two questions. The first question is, you'll see in Hosea 2:18, there's a covenant made. And we're going to answer the question, what covenant is that? Is it just a different covenant? Is it a covenant that we've known about or heard about in other places? What is that covenant in 2:18? And there's actually another prophet in the Old Testament who gives a very similar statement about Israel being many days without a list of things and then turning to God and seeking him. I mean, it sounds just like Hosea 3. And so we're going to look at that really briefly. So that's the plan. So we're going to go ahead and read Hosea 2 a little bit at a time. Again, this is going to go really fast, but then we'll answer those two questions after. Okay, we're starting with Hosea 2:2. High level, again, why are we skipping verse 1? We don't have time to talk about that, but know that even in the Hebrew ordering, chapter 2 actually starts with 1 verse 10. So there's actually a difference, and that's true in other books of the Bible like Joel and other places. But the chapter and verse numberings came much later than the text. Even if you think about the author of Hebrews says it's written somewhere that the Lord rested on the seventh day. And so they didn't have the chapters and numbers like we do. But we're going to start with Hosea 2:2, and that first section is Hosea 2:2 through 5. And just to help, let me go back a couple slides. You can see the sections here. And just to help you see it for yourself where those section breaks are, you'll notice the word therefore. We talked about that on Sunday. Therefore in verse 9, right? You see it in verse 9. You see it in verse 6. You see it in verse 14. Those are the three sections that correspond to the three children of Gomer and Hosea. And then you'll see in verses 16 and in verse 21, it starts with, and it will come about in that day, and it will come about in that day. So that just gives you sort of a really quick, something you can latch your eyes on and know where the sections are. But Hosea 2:2 through 5, let's read that. Contend with your mother, contend, for she, let me translate this the way I think it should be translated. For is she not my wife, and am I not her husband? And let her put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and expose her as on the day when she was born. I will also make her like a wilderness, make her like desert land, and slay her with thirst. And I'll have no compassion on her children, because they are children of harlotry. For their mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them has acted shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. And as we mentioned Sunday, this corresponds to the beginning. A lot of the similar words used, a lot of the similar themes, the word for committing harlotry, the land, the familial words, all correspond to the very first part of Hosea 1, where the Lord speaks to Hosea and says, go take Gomer. And here, this is again a nice introduction to this chapter, where it's very clear that the wife is not acting as she should, even though, isn't she my wife? Am I not her husband? Why is she acting this way? And a warning of judgment if the mother doesn't listen to the children's contention. Right? So very simple. Hosea 2:6 through 8 is the next. And again, this is what corresponds to the child Jezreel in the previous chapter. So let me read that. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up her way with thorns. I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her paths. She will pursue her lovers, but she will not overtake them, and she will seek them, but will not find them. She'll say, I will go back to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now. And remember, we talked about how this is not as severe as it's about to get, where he talks about destroying her and talks about putting an end to all her feasts. And this is, I'm gonna keep her from running some of those paths. I'm gonna slow her down. I'm gonna essentially, and we'll look at this on Sunday from Hosea 1, I'm gonna put an end to sort of her dominion. When Hosea wrote, it was the same time that Amos wrote. And if you read the book of Amos, people had multiple houses, probably not a lot unlike us in America, with people with summer houses and lake houses, and really didn't care about the poor or didn't care about their brothers, and just really prosperous. It was the days of Jeroboam II and the prophecy of Jezreel, and this prophecy is saying those days are over. Those days are going to end. Your prosperity is going to come to an end, and you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do, because they're not listening to the prophets right now because things are good. And you're telling me you're warning me? Everything looks really good. He says, well, I'm going to put an end to that, and I'm going to restrict your kingdom. You're going to lose a lot of land. You're going to lose a lot of prosperity, and then you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do. So that's what happened with Jezreel that we'll study on Sunday. That's what happens here in Hosea 2. The next one starts with, therefore, I don't think I read far enough, for she does not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil. And we mentioned previously that each of these sections ends with a note about giving of gifts and knowledge between lovers, right? The first one ended with the mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them, verse 5, has acted shamefully. She said, I'll go after my lovers who give me my bread and my water. This section, the same way in verse 8, ends with that same thing. She doesn't know that it was I who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So the judgment gets worse in the second section, which corresponds to Lo Ruhamah in chapter 1. It says in verse 9, therefore I will take back my grain at harvest time, and my new wine in its season. I will also take away my wool and my flax, given to cover her nakedness, and I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers. No one will rescue her out of my hand. I will put an end to all her gaiety, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, all her festal assemblies. And I'll destroy her vines and fig trees, of which she said, these are my wages, which my lovers have given me. And I will make them a forest. So remember, in the exile and the destruction, that's what all the prophets pictured, is a total destruction where nothing was left. All the trees were cut down. Remember, even before, when Jerusalem was spared, it was like, I've said this several times, it was like a cucumber hut in a field. Everything else, there was nothing built up. It was all completely destroyed. That's what he says here. I'm going to make them a forest. The beast of the field will devour them. We said that in the Isaiah prophecy. There'll be nobody around. So they're going to have to, if you go to try to till the little bit that's left, you have to take weapons with you because they're going to be wild animals. And I'll punish her for the days of the Baals, when she used to offer sacrifices to them and adorn herself with earrings and jewelry and follow her lovers, so that she forgot me, declares the Lord. And again, this is the destruction that's pictured in verse 1, where he says, I'm not going to have any more mercy on you. I'm gonna send you away. And then last, a very short section, 14 and 15, it says, and this was misnumbered, I noticed in the PowerPoint from Sunday. So if you had that written down, note that it's 14 through 15. It says, therefore, there's our last, therefore, behold, I will allure her. I'll bring her into the wilderness and speak kindly to her. And I will give her her vineyards from there. And the valley of Achor is a door of hope. And she will sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. And what kind of judgment did we say this was? How did it feel to us? No judgment at all, right? This is like things are changing. You know, I've basically made you a wilderness. I've sent you away, but I'm going to allure you back. I'll bring you back to the wilderness after you've been scattered. I'll bring you back, and I'll start speaking kindly to you, and I'll give you all these gifts. Again, each section ends with a note of gifts. And that's what is pictured by Lo Ami, the third child in chapter 1. Yet you're not my people, I'm not your God. But in the place where it was said to you, you're not my people, I'm not your God, it's going to be said to you, you are the sons of the living God. And so there's this last section that is really the start of a transition. And if you'll remember, that was the argument for why there's a poetical section in the midst of this prose, in the midst of this narrative, because you have this amazing change of events. And in the same way, remember that Paul in Romans 11 ends with a doxology. Hosea, at this point, breaks out into song, as it were, to tell the same story. And so in 18, the story has really taken a turn. And these 18 through 23 are going to be the verses that correspond to Hosea 3, which talks about the future of Israel. He says, in that day I will make, 16, it will come about in that day, declares Yahweh, that you will call me Ishi, which is like my man, and will no longer call me Baali, my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, so that they will be mentioned by their names no more. In that day I will also make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, the creeping things of the ground, and I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and will make them lie down in safety. And I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, and loving kindness and in compassion, and I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. Then you will know, Yahweh, again, you see it ending with a section of knowing who her true lover is and all the things that God is going to give to them. Now, this corresponds, again, to the very beginning of Hosea chapter 3, where he goes and purchases back Gomer, right? And at the very end of the last one, I want this is going to be important because we'll talk about it later. At the very end of verse 15, he says, I'm going to make it like when the day you came out of Egypt, right? So they were languishing. Abraham had all those promises, but they were languishing in Egypt. And then he brings them out of Egypt. And what was the first thing he did on the way out of Egypt with them? He made a covenant with them. And what do we have here, right? And that day I'm going to make a covenant with you. I'm going to betroth you. So that's going to be important. We're going to come back to it because we want to ask the question, what covenant is that? Okay, and I will, as I pointed out on Sunday, note it's a betrothal, which is really interesting, right? Covenant, we think of covenants with marriage, right? We talk about marriages as covenants, but this is the betrothal part of the covenant, which is just as binding, but it's not full consummation, right? So it's interesting that he describes it as a betrothal, and that'll become important later too. But let's finish the chapter. Again, I said we'd get through this really fast. Hosea 2, 21 through 23. It will come about in that day, so there's that same phrase, that I will respond, declares Yahweh. I will respond to the heavens, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain, to the new wine, and to the oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion, and I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. So it's just a complete reversal of everything. You see in that last verse, the three kids. Again, I'm making the argument that these tie back to Hosea 1 and 3. Did you see the three kids in that last verse? Or the end of 22 and the last verse? They'll respond to Jezreel. That's the first kid. All right, I'll have compassion on her who did not have compassion. That's Lo Ruhamah. That's the second kid. And I will say to those who are not my people, that's Lo Ami, not my people. So he's tied it all back together. He says there's going to be complete restoration with, again, grain and new wine and oil and blessings. Very physical sounding blessings, again, which if we weren't going to, if I even just stopped here and said, I haven't given you all the Sherlock Holmes clues yet, it just sounds really physical, at least. Okay, but we're done with Hosea 2 now. All right, so we can take a breath because that was really fast. And I want to ask the question, and I'll show why it's important. I want to ask the question, what covenant is that in verse 18 of chapter 2? When he says, I'm going to bring you back as if I brought you out of Egypt. I'm going to lure you back into the land, into the wilderness, and I'm going to make a covenant with you there. Covenant with the beasts of the field. I'm going to abolish war. I'm going to betroth you to me forever. What covenant do you think it is?
New covenant.
A new covenant, right? I do too. I think it is too. Now let me catch up here. Okay, let me just tell you why I think it's clearly the new covenant. Okay, so I can't see this very well, and I don't have it written down. But the new covenant, there's a promise of a new heart, the ability to obey, not just the command to obey. There's a new heart of flesh. There's a spirit poured out. And you see that in removing the names of the Baals from the mouth. This is God taking away their foolish, sinful previous behavior. He's doing that himself. And for the sake of time, because I do want to go quickly, because everyone said the new covenant, I don't feel like I need to convince you, and you'll have these slides. I was going to read the bold ones in each case, But just know that the prophets of the new covenant, where Jeremiah is saying it's the new covenant, or Isaiah, or Ezekiel are declaring the new covenant very clearly, they're going to say the same thing. So if I turned here, it would say, I'm going to give you a new heart. Or, and in the next one, which is, he's going to make peace. He's going to make a covenant, he said, with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and the creeping things of the ground. Well, surprisingly, there's an aspect of the new covenant in the latter prophets, which is you don't have to be afraid of animals. And even Isaiah, I don't know if I bolded it, I did. Remember the Isaiah one, which is the lion will lie down with the lamb, and there's going to be peace among animal kingdoms. And it's going to be different than when there's all this devastation and the animals are something they have to look out for. You remember even the story of the lion killing the prophet in Kings? I mean, there's just, wild beast, and that's not going to be the case in this future covenant when they're under this covenant, which we know, again, which I'm arguing is the millennial kingdom. There is abolishment of war, peace with enemies. That's, again, if I read these passages in the new covenant, it's very clear that Israel's going to be in safety in their land. Betroth you to me forever is what I'm calling out there. It's called an eternal covenant. The new covenant is one that is never ending. There's not another covenant spoken after it. It's the last, because it has everything it needs. And last, you'll know the Lord, you'll know Yahweh, which is a refrain, especially in Ezekiel, but is really kind of the end of the new covenant. After God gives them a new heart, as they see the blessings that he pours out, they know who Yahweh is and they understand. So again, we all said new covenant. I don't think I need to convince you of that, but it's important. And it's important, again, because I'm going to do some slide surfing here for just a second. I should have put them in order. But remember here for just a second that we said this section that talks about the new covenant relates to Hosea 3, where Gomer is bought back by Hosea. They pair together, right? And so that's important because we know whatever is being pictured in Hosea going to purchase Gomer, when he says, go again, love a woman who loves another man, and Hosea goes and buys her. Well, that is symbolic of it. Hosea 2 helps us know the symbolism there is speaking about God making a new covenant with Israel, right? And why that's important, let me slide surf forward, is that's going to tell us that at this part in the prophecy, remember the order of the rice, you got to put the steps in order. Well, whatever is the many days in the last days of Israel, which is the question, what are the many days, whatever it is, it's got to come after the Lord making, at least betrothing or inaugurating, a new covenant with Israel. Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, I see a lot of blank faces and I want to slow down. So yes, you understand? I mean, I know some people are not with us, that may be harder, but for those who are with us, Kathleen, yes.
Can you say that again? I was writing.
Please, yeah, I want to say it again just because a lot of blank faces. So we think, so the Sherlock Holmes clue is that one clue that we're chasing down is that Hosea 2 corresponds to Hosea 1 and 3 in each of those sections, right? In the section of the covenant, which we said, hey, this is the new covenant. I can tell it's the new covenant, right? I can tell because of the way it's described. That corresponds to Hosea 3, 1 through 2, right? And so when God said, hey, I want you to go take a wife of harlotry, he said, hey, what did that mean? And we said, and we'll talk about it on Sunday, but hey, that's God covenanting with Israel and Mount Sinai, even though they were not a faithful nation, and he enters into this covenant with them, right? And then we talk about this, hey, I want you to go love a woman again who's loved by her husband, who loves another man. And Hosea goes and purchases her, right? And what is that? That's the purchase of God of the new covenant, right? And so that's going to be important because now we know that this step refers to the purchase of God in the new covenant. However, whatever that means. And again, to be more clear, I'm kind of trying to save it for Sunday so I can have something to say on Sunday that you haven't heard. But you think about, how did God initiate or inaugurate the new covenant?
Through the death of Christ.
Through the death of Christ, right? When did that happen? What did Jesus say? He said, this is the new covenant in my blood, right? And he's inaugurated. What did Paul say? I'm a minister of what? The new covenant, right? So the new covenant was inaugurated. What did Hosea's purchase of Gomer represent? It represented God's purchase of Israel through the death of Christ, right? And so that's important first. That helps us to know what Hosea 3, 1, and 2 is about. I think we could have figured it out without it, but it helps confirm that, right? And it also helps us because when we get ready to answer, what are the many days of Israel? Well, I don't know what they are, but they got to be after the death of Christ, right? Remember the rice slide? We got to put things in order, and they got to be in order. that's very clear from the Hebrew grammar there that this is a sequential story. So if that's the case, then the many days have to be after Christ being on earth.
Is this the millennium?
No. So all this is when Christ came to earth, died, was crucified, and rose again and ascended, right? When he poured out the Spirit as part of the new covenant, and it says in Acts 2, what you're seeing is related to the pouring out of the Spirit in the new covenant. These are, the day of the Lord. You see this in the first century when Jesus died. That's the purchase of God. When you're talking about the millennial kingdom stuff, that's going to come here as we answer what's the latter days and what's the many days. But whatever the latter days and many days are, which is Hosea 3 through 5, it's got to come after Hosea 3 and 1 and 2, which is the death of Christ. So that's what we'll talk about in more detail on Sunday. And the good news is, if you come on Wednesday night, you get to hear it twice. And so the first time you hear it, you scratch your head and think about it. And then hopefully on Sunday, you're like, okay, I think I'm getting it a little bit more. So, but that's all I want to say about the covenant. And so we have one more question to answer. You remember I said there was another prophet that said something really similar. He said Israel's going to be many days without a list of things. And then after, he's going to turn and seek God, which is, let me just read Hosea 3, 4 through 5, just so you hear the echo. The sons of Israel will remain many days without, and he lists 6 things. And then afterward, they will return and seek, the same 2 words used by this other prophet, we'll get to in just a second, will return and seek Yahweh their God and David their king. So what is that other prophet? It's in 2 Chronicles 15. So if you want to turn there. And this will be the last thing we do. I just want to me, if we're going to talk about Hosea 3, you got to at least answer, why does it sound so much like this prophecy of Azariah, the son of Oded? Let's start by just looking at verse 3 and 4, and then I'll explain a little bit more. But verse 3, for many days, right, there's that same phrase, for many days Israel was without the true God, without a teaching priest, without law, but they turned in their distress to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and they sought him. They turned and sought him. Same thing. So again, really similar language, really interesting. Wow, what's the deal here? Well, let me give you the context of this. It is not a prophecy, right? You could even hear it. It's looking back, right? But look at verse 8 real quick before I give you the context. When Asa heard these words and the prophecy which Azariah spoke. Okay, now he spoke some words and he spoke a prophecy. You do see a prophecy in verse 2 and verse 7, right? Verse 2, he said, look, if you seek him, you'll find him. If you forsake him, he'll forsake you. He's saying this is what's going to happen. In verse 7, don't lose courage. There's a reward for your work. But he also said some words too, and that's verses 3 to 6. So it wasn't a prophecy. Frank's exactly right. It was looking back. Now let me give you the context really quick. This was Asa, which was a king of the southern kingdom, a good king, and 1,000,000-man army coming from Ethiopia. 1,000,000-man army, massive army. And, Asa, you can read about it at the very end of 14. They go up, they get ready to fight him. And Asa in verse 11 of chapter 14 calls to Yahweh as God, says, Yahweh, there's no one besides you to help. Between the powerful, 1,000,000 people is pretty strong, and those who have no strength. So help us, O Yahweh our God, for we trust in you, and in your name have come against this multitude. Yahweh, you are God, do not let man prevail against us. And so Yahweh routs the Ethiopians, this 1,000,000-man army, he routs them. And the prophet comes to say, hey, that was really good. You did right. That was very impressive, Asa. And he goes out and says, verse 2, he goes out and says, listen to me, Asa, and Judah and Benjamin. Yahweh's with you when you're with him. And if you seek him, he'll let you find him. But if you forsake him, he'll forsake you. And then he says, for many days, Israel was without the true God, without a teaching priest, without law. But in their distress, they turned to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and sought him. And he let them find him. And in those times, whatever those many days were, when in those times, there was no peace to him who went out or to him who came in, for many disturbances afflicted all the inhabitants of the lands. Nation was crushed by nation, city by city, for God troubled them with every kind of distress. So let me ask you, what time period do you think he's talking about? That they were many days without the true God, without a teaching priest, and without the law, and then they would turn to him, and they would seek him, and he would let them find him. What time period do you think he's talking about?
After the King Solomon,
Tell me more.
after the first temple was sacked.
So say more why you think it.
Well, they came. I don't know, Jesus came in with the new covenants.
No. So Asa, but Asa was probably, I don't remember. I should have prepared better. Asa was, I don't know, 4 kings after Solomon, 5 kings. So he's not too far after Solomon. I follow. I understand why you're saying that. Yeah. So no, he's looking back. So it's got to be sometime before that. It's a many days period. So don't be thinking, I'm thinking, oh, it was that 20-year period. Many days. So we're talking hundreds of years.
in the land of Egypt.
Not 40 years in the land of Egypt, I don't think. And the main reason I think that is in those times there was no peace to him who went out, and many disturbances afflicted all the inhabitants of the lands.
Time of the judges.
The judges. That's what I think. That's what I think as well. Let me try to make a few arguments for that. They were without a true God. So Judges says in Judges 2, after this great period, he's made a covenant. Joshua goes in the land. Boy, it sure, they got all the blessings of the covenant. I mean, it says the Lord fulfilled everything all the good words he had said to Moses, his servant. Right? They look like a covenant people, don't they? At that point, they're defeating their nations. They're at peace. They have prosperity. But then Judges starts with, another generation arose who didn't what? They didn't know Yahweh, right? So they're without the true God, without a teaching priest. Tell me, what was a lot of the Torah about, right? What was Leviticus was about? It's priests and the law and sacrifices. One second, let me finish one point. I want to answer that. What priests do we have in Judges? You got that one, Micah. Remember Micah?
Yeah.
If you could call that a priest. What about law? How many times do you think the word law is found in the book of Judges? 0. How is that possible? How is that? That is impossible. They just got this law from God, and the word's not found the entire time in the book, right? So amazing that, I would say that's the period. And sure enough, right, they would turn away from these things, and then what would they do? They'd be like, that didn't work too well. And they'd come back and they would seek God, and God would let them find them. And Azariah is saying, hey, that's what used to happen. Many days that happened. And they would turn and they would seek God, and he would let you find them. And so that's what you should. Asa, great job. That's what you should do. If you do that, he'll let you find them. So Kathleen, let me pause and answer your question.
I don't remember.
I'm sorry.
It's okay, no, that's
Okay. If you think of it, interrupt me. So I think that's the period that Azariah has in mind. And so you say, okay, well, why? Maybe it's just coincidence. Why do Hosea and Azariah sound so much alike? Why are those prophecies or those words? Because again, Azariah isn't really a prophecy. He's looking back. Why do they sound so much alike? Well, the fact is, Hosea 3:4-5 sounds a lot like Judges. You may not think of it, but think about it. He says there are going to be many days without a king. Does that make you think of anything from the book of Judges?
There was no king.
There was no king. Repeated refrain 4 times. There wasn't a king in those days. Judges is the only place. Hosea says they're going to be without ephod or teraphim. Okay. Judges is the only place those 2 terms are found together. And it's found twice in Judges 17 and 18. And like the surprising, Hosea said they're going to be without sacrifice. And like the surprising absence of Torah in Judges, there's only one sacrifice in the entire book as well. I mean, you just gave a ton of regulations about what sacrifices you should do, how to do them, when to do them, and they're not anywhere in Judges. So when Hosea says you're going to be without king, without ephod, without cherubim, without outside idols, without sacrifice, he's sounding a little bit like the Judges. His words are not just sounding like Azariah, which they are, but they're sounding like Judges. And that makes sense because, if math, we have some math fans here. If A equals B and B equals C, what's true of A and C? A equals C, right? So if Hosea sounds like Azariah, Judges, and Azariah sounds like Judges, well, it makes sense that Hosea sounds like Azariah, but they sound a lot alike. And so I want to add one more interesting thing before I give maybe just one thought about why this might be important. And that is, it's very well known, very well understood that Hosea likes to talk about future events by referring back to past ones. It's very commonly pointed out in commentaries. So their exile is spoken of as a return to Egypt. They're going to go back to Egypt. And again, I'm not going to read for the sake of time. I know we're already really long. And their restoration is considered a new Exodus. And I just put a quote up here which talks about this and how Hosea particularly likes to refer to future events using these three sort of time periods, including the book of Judges. And so again, it seems like Azariah's words and Hosea's prophecies are similar because they both refer to the period of the Judges. Azariah looking back, encouraging Asa, Hosea looking forward and picturing a many days of waiting and a turning in the latter days using the language of Judges. So what can we learn on this? So I want you to think back to Israel's history and what came, we've already said it, what came just before Judges? Yep, and what came, what was it?
The conquering of the land.
The conquering the land and the covenant people, right? He enters into covenant and he says, you're going to be this covenant people. Let me tell you the blessings that are going to come with you being a covenant people. Here's what it is. And to David's point, they started to experience that. But for many days after that, many days, did they look like a covenant people of God?
No.
No, right? The nations were ruling over them. They didn't have any of the blessings. They didn't look like it at all. They were God's special people. They were supposed to be the head of the nations. When did that start to happen again? When did that start to show up again?
Certainly under Solomon.
Solomon, yeah. David and Solomon, right? The Davidic covenant's made. He installs as king. They start to look like what God has said they were going to look like, right? But many years they didn't look like that. Many years they were without those things and didn't look like it. And Hosea says that's what it's going to be like in the future. There's going to be an inauguration, a betrothal, a starting of a new covenant with Israel. And we can read Hosea 2 if you need me to read it again, 16 to 20. That's the betrothal. That's the new covenant. There's going to be a new covenant, right? And that's what Hosea 3, 1 to 2 pictures with Hosea purchasing Gomer again. There's going to be a purchasing back, but is full consummation going to happen? Are they going to look like the people that God purchased? And is Israel going to show all the blessings that come with the new covenant? What about Gomer? Did she look like Hosea's wife? What did he say to Gomer? You got to wait many days. I may have purchased you, but you need to wait many days. A really hard verse to explain, which I will explain on Sunday. It's a really hard verse to understand, but she's not. The marriage isn't consummated. For many days she waits, right? And Hosea says that's what the future is going to look like. There'll be an inauguration of covenant, but then there's going to be many days where it sure doesn't look like it. They're going to wait without these things for many days, and eventually there would be a return to God and to David, their king. Again, remember, after the period of Judges, it was David, their king, and Solomon that brought about them looking like the covenant people of God. And he says there's going to be a return to David, their king, in the latter days as well. All right, so that's it. That's all I want to say. I recognize probably a lot of loose ends, but that's the good news again about coming on Wednesday. You'll hear it again on Sunday and have 4 days in between to think about it. And we can obviously talk about it if you have questions after, or if Kathleen thought of hers.
I did, but
Okay.
I'll wait.
We'll wait. Okay, so we're going to move into our prayer time, and David is going to lead that for us.